Hey church, welcome and thank you for worshiping with us. Wherever you're at, in your home, watching on your TV, your laptop, or your phone, you are a part of this family. And you can watch and listen to past messages by heading to mycornerstone.family. On our sermons page, you can view playlists and search for past messages and more. You can even listen to our content by subscribing to Cornerstone America's podcast, which you can find on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. I hope you enjoyed the message and thank you for being a part of the Cornerstone family. Right into our message this morning. We're talking about asking for a friend. We're talking about some hard questions from the Bible. Do we have some good answers? That's what we've been talking about over the last several weeks. We're going to continue that for just a few more weeks. If you go to my next picture, one of the reasons I'm doing this is, many of you guys know Miss Lenora. She is not here today, so I'm going to show her picture without her being here. But so what Miss Lenora does is she knows her Bible very well, but she does have a lot of questions about it, as so do I. And so she will make a list of questions for me and kind of compile them. And when the list gets long enough, we will schedule a phone appointment. And we will have this phone conversation where we will go question after question after question after question. We will try to wrestle through it and answer it as best as we can, which is always a lot of fun. But there are just some difficult things in the Bible, like how do we answer this? And there's a man that once said this. He said, "I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned." And I love that. We've always had this open policy in our home, of course, in the church, that, man, we're open to any questions. Let's wrestle through some of these, and some of them are very difficult. And so we're going to wrestle through a difficult one this morning as we talk about showing no mercy. There is a text in the Bible where God tells his people to show no mercy to another group. And so Psalm 86, verse 15 says this, "But you, Lord, are compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness." And there's some that would argue that, hey, you can talk about God being loving, compassionate, all you want, but at the same time, we see things in the Bible where God is, in a sense, ordering genocide and almost like an ethnic cleansing going on. And how do we wrestle through those questions and those scriptures? Like Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1 and 2 says, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and drive out before you many nations," and he lists these nations, 7 stronger than you. Go to verse 2. He goes on and he says this, "And when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you have defeated them, you must destroy them totally." And not only that, he says, "Make no treaty with them, but show them no mercy." How do we understand this? Destroy them totally. What does that mean? Show them no mercy. This is one of the tough questions we're going to deal with and wrestle with that today. And some people would look at these verses and other verses similar to it and say, well, basically God is ordering genocide. There's an ethnic cleansing going on, that there was this like xenophobic, like the children of Israel, or maybe God is xenophobic, that he doesn't like anybody outside of his people, which is not true at all. And of course, the people making statements like this, was this genocide, they're not really looking closely to know all the details and relay what is happening here very honestly. But anytime you mention genocide or ethnic cleansing, that's just disturbing to us, isn't it? It raises a red flag. And is that what God is doing here? I don't think so. But in 2015, we took a group from this church on a mission trip to Cambodia. We went to Phnom Penh. If you go to my first picture, this is, or used to be, a high school there that was on a dusty road on the outskirts of the city, Phnom Penh. And in 1976, the Khmer Rouge renamed it the S-21, and they turned it into a torture, interrogation, and execution center. There were 14,000 people that we know of that entered into this prison. Only 7 came out alive. If you go to my next picture, this was genocide. This was ethnic cleansing. As I said, 14,000 people are known to have entered in. Only 7 survived. If you go to the next picture, we were able to meet one of the survivors. He was there that day when we were visiting the S-21. Now, probably the most gruesome images from this genocide back in the late 70s coming out of Cambodia was probably the mass graves, right? The killing fields and stuff like that. But probably the most haunting were the portraits that were taken in this S-21 prison, that they not only documented, writing out how they interrogated, what they did, but they documented it with photographs, which is most disturbing. And so you have people that read these different texts in the Bible and wonder, is that what God is asking for in the Old Testament? Was he asking for an ethnic cleansing or a genocide? And it's not even close to what he was doing. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, when God was talking to Abraham, where this kind of all started, he said, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who will curse you, and all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. What we find in the scriptures is anytime God calls somebody, it's not for the exclusion of others, but it's for the blessing of others. And he called Abraham not to exclude the nations around him, but so there was a way to include them in the blessing of God. And that's what this verse is about. And that's what God was doing. And Abraham was not xenophobic. I mean, he had relationships. He met and honored Melchizedek of a different ethnic group. He encountered the leaders of the Egyptians and the Philistines. When we talk about the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, that was a bit of a mixed group, and Moses married a Cushite woman. You think about Rahab the harlot was brought into the children of Israel. She was a Gentile. And so there was no phobia around them, but it was simply a way that God was bringing blessing to the nations. He had to call some out in order so that all could be blessed through them. But we still, if you go to my next verse, if we still look at this, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, destroy them totally, show them no mercy. How are we to understand this? And so I want to give you a few ways that we could better maybe put this into a context that we can understand and wrap our minds around. Let's talk about my first point is the sin of the Canaanites had reached full measure. One of the things we know is that back when God was talking to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, he says to him, in the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has reached its full measure, or has not reached its full measure. So what God was saying to Abraham says, hey, I'm going to bring you into this land. And I'm going to bring you in. One of the reasons I'm bringing you in is because the sin of those people living there will have reached full measure, and judgment will be needed. They need to be moved out of the land. And so God was giving them time to repent. They didn't. Their sin reached full measure, and so God was going to bring his people into this land to occupy. So one of the things we know by looking at the Bible in totality is that the sin of the Canaanites had reached its full measure. It says the sin of the Ammonites, and the Ammonites is a term here used generally as non-Israelites of Canaanites in generic form. That's what he was talking about. But then the question comes to be, if you go to my next slide, the question that we're asked is, were the Canaanites that wicked? I mean, were they really that bad that God needed to move them out? Well, I guess God is a good judge of that, but we know that they were wicked. And I'm not going to make the claim that they were more wicked than anybody else living at that time, but they were abundantly wicked. And according to what God had told Abraham, that their sin would reach full measure when judgment needed to come upon them and they needed to be moved out. And one of the reasons God wanted them out is because God didn't want his people coming into that land, picking up their practices and living the lifestyle that they were living, that was full of incest and adultery, temple sex, bestiality, homosexuality, and child sacrifice, to mention a few. But that's what was happening at that day and at that time. And what's interesting is that God would bring judgment. As we read the Old Testament, God would bring judgment not just on the countries around Israel, but he would also bring them on Israel at times when they needed it, when their sin would reach full measure, so to speak. So God didn't play favorites where he brought judgment on one and not judgment on another. God played very fair. Let me go to my next point here. Number two is this was a very unique time in Israel's history. And as we read this, we read of these holy wars, or we could call them Yahweh wars, that are, I think, emotionally charged biblical problems that we wrestle with what was happening during this time. But this was a very unique time in Israel's history where God was calling them to drive out certain countries from their midst. War was very common in this day. It was a way of life. It was a matter of survival in the ancient Near East. And so you had a lot of warfare going on. But again, this was a very unique time when God was really calling Israel to drive out different nations around them. A time I think that was really unique to this time period and isn't really being repeated. And one of my favorite books, I read this years ago, is God a Moral Monster. This is one of my all-time favorite books, where Paul Copeland talks about this and many other things that are hard to understand in the Old Testament. So if you have questions about this or other events like this in the Old Testament, he does a great job of pulling them out in totality and talking about them. So I highly recommend it. That's one of my favorite all-time books. So the scripture is very realistic about what was happening and how that the sin was going on and they needed to be driven out of the land. But again, a very unique time where we had these Yahweh wars or holy wars that God was calling the nation of Israel to move these nations out. Let's go to my next verse, Exodus 23, verse 27 through 30. He says, I will send my terror. And let me go to point three, number three. There we go. Okay, so here's something else we have to wrestle with is, does he want us, or did he want them to drive them out of the land? Or did he want them to destroy them completely? This becomes very interesting as we talk about it. I'm sorry, go back to Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 and 2. Go back one slide. I jumped ahead on you. What's interesting, when we read this, we tend to focus here on destroy them totally, show them no mercy. But up above here, he talks about driving them out. And there's two sets of language that we see in the Old Testament when God's talking about these foreign countries. He talks about the Israelites driving them out of the land, but then he talks about destroying them totally. And those are really two different things. You either drive them out or you destroy them totally. And so what we find is that this driving out language is very much more common than to destroy them only. And I think what was happening, and we'll talk about some of these verses as we go, but I think what was happening was God was calling these nations to move out. Judgment had come upon them, wanted them to move out, and the non-militant ones would flee and leave. Those militarily that would stay, Israelites would come in and wipe them out. So what would happen was, I think they would drive out many of them. Those that stayed militarily, they would be defeated in most cases. And I think that's what was happening most of the time. So we have this driving out language that we have to take a look at also, not just simply destroying. Let's go to Exodus 23, where we see this also. He says, I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion every nation you encounter. And I will make all your enemies turn their backs and run. Again, this idea of driving out. I will send the horde ahead of you to drive the Hittites, the Canaanites, the Hittites out of your way. He says, but I will not drive them out in a single year, because the land would become desolate and the wild animals too numerous for you. Little by little, I will drive them out before you, and you will, until you have increased enough to take possession of the land. So here we have this idea of them driving them out slowly, little by little, taking land. I think this is a little bit different picture than sometimes we imagine when we read destroy them, annihilate them. We see this very quick military move that just wipes everything out. And I think what happened is a little bit closer to this right here, where little by little they were driving the enemy out of the land, taking over, and this was maybe a more realistic view of what was happening. Instead of taking just one verse and saying, hey, they destroyed, they went in and just annihilated everybody. So I think there was an expulsion, there was a driving out, there also was a destroying that took place. Deuteronomy 28, verse 63. Listen to this. Even this happened to Israel sometimes. It says, God is talking to the Israelites here. He says, just as it pleased the Lord to make you prosper and increase in number, so it will please him to ruin and destroy you. God used that very same language towards his own people if they would continue in sin, but he wasn't going to destroy them as wipe them off the face of the earth or kill them. How was he going to ruin them or destroy them? You will be uprooted from the land you are entering to possess. And what we see in the Old Testament, that God would move his people into the promised land as they were obedient, and when they were disobedient, he allowed the other nations to come in and move them out of the land. In a sense, there was a ruining or destroying that was taking place. He was moving them out. And I think some of this ruin or destroy is a war rhetoric that is used, and we use it frequently in our day and age, but we don't even think about it. When we have a great football game, right? Football season is coming. And we come in maybe the next day at church and you ask, how did your team do? We said, we did great. We killed them. Now, if you didn't know how I was speaking, you would think maybe literally they killed them. Oh, we destroyed them. We use war rhetoric all the time. Some of this language in the Bible is typical of that day and age. It's war rhetoric. Was God literally going to ruin them and destroy them so that Israel did not exist? No, but he was going to uproot them and take them out of the land because of their sin. Just as the Canaanites, he was going to uproot them and take them out of the land because of their sin. I'm telling you, God didn't play favorites. If the Israelites sinned, he would move them out. If they did well, if they were obedient, he would move them in. It's very easy to see. See this all through it. Let me give you another example of this. This becomes very interesting. 1 Samuel 15, verses 1 through 3. Samuel said to Saul, this is what the Lord Almighty asks. I will punish the Amalekites, for what they did to Israel when they laid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go attack them. Look, notice the language here. Totally destroy them. Are you guys with me? No, you're not. Why are you not with me? All right, he says, totally destroy them. Maybe we get back on track. He says, I will punish them, right, for what they did to Israel. And they waylaid them to come up from Egypt. Now go attack them. Totally, he says, totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death the men, women, children, and infants. Like I said, do not spare them. Put to death the men, women, children, and infants, and the cattle, the sheep, the camels, and the donkeys. He says, put them all to death. Now, I wonder, did God really want them to kill all the men, all the women, the children, and the infants? I mean, that's a possibility. That's what it says. But what I find interesting about this text or this verse, if he killed them, which we know, because what happens here is Samuel comes to Saul. He's disappointed because he didn't kill them all. The king was still left. If you know the chapter, he comes, and so Samuel actually kills the king. And they also kept some of the animals. It doesn't say they killed them. I'm not sure what they did with them. But if they killed all of the enemy here, why in 1 Samuel 27, verses 8 and 9, David and his men went up and raided the Gershites and the Girzites, and who else? The Amalekites. I thought Saul had killed them all but the king. And then Samuel had killed the king. But yet, a couple chapters later, we still have them here. And what's interesting about this verse, if you go to verse 9, whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive. But he took the sheep and the cattle, the donkeys, the camels, clothes, and then he returned. So here it says, whenever David attacked an area, he didn't leave man or woman alive. So if Saul, I guess, didn't get it all done, then David must have got it all done here, where he killed all of them so that none of them were left. But if we go to 1 Samuel 30, verse 1, David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day, and now the Amalekites, they're still there. I thought Saul killed them all, then I thought David killed them all, and now they're still here. In fact, you can go even in the Chronicles, they're still around some years later. Now, why is it that it talks about them destroying them all, but yet we still have them in later places in the Bible? If David got them all, or Saul got them all, and Samuel killed the king, none of them were left. Every man, woman, child, and infant was killed. How do we have them still in the Bible at a later date? And see, what I'm suggesting is that some of this is war rhetoric, that yes, they did move them out, dispossess them from the land, but they probably didn't kill every single one. I think this is maybe how it worked. Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 29 maybe gives us insight to what was happening. How then did this driving out work? This is what Jeremiah writes. He says, at the sound of horsemen and archers, every town takes to flight. Probably what happened when they saw the Israelites coming, people started leaving the city. Isn't that what happens usually when war's happening? A lot of people are fleeing the Ukraine. And this is what happens. As the sound of horsemen and archers, every town takes to flight. I mean, those non-combatants are going to start leaving. Some go into the thickets, some climb up the rocks, all the towns are deserted, no one lives. And those that are non-military are going to leave. They're going to dispossess. They are going to be driven out. And God's people are going to come in. Who are they going to fight? They're going to fight the militants that stay. I think this gives us an idea of a lot of what happened back then. All right, so let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1 and 2. We have this idea of them destroying them all. We have them showing no mercy. We also have this driving out idea, and we're trying to juggle these two. And how does the scriptures mean for us to take them? And going in the context of here, if we go to verses 3 and 4, he says, do not marry with them. This becomes very interesting. He says, do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons and take their daughters for your sons. He doesn't want them intermixing with them. Now, if he had just commanded them to destroy them all, why does he need to talk to them about intermarrying with them? If you were going to destroy every single one of them so that none of them survive, man, woman, child, infant, then there would be no reason to tell them that they couldn't intermarry with them, would there? Verses 3 and 4, he says, do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons to take their daughters for your sons. This is why, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods. The Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. Oh, here we have this language again, quickly destroy you. What does he mean by destroy? This is the Israelites. If they intermarry with him, God will destroy them now. Here's the thing. Here's what's happening. Go to my next slide. The key wasn't to destroy the Canaanites, it was to destroy the Canaanite religion. That's what God didn't want. He didn't want them getting close to them so that they lived the same kind of lifestyle, because he had called them to live separately. Verses 5 and 6, again, in the context of our Deuteronomy chapter 7. This is what you are to do to them. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down the Asherah poles, and burn their idols in the fire. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. This is what God wanted. He didn't want them to pick up their religion and use it. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 2 and 3. He says, you shall utterly destroy all the places where their nations, whom you shall dispossess, serve their gods. Again, talking about not destroying the people necessarily, but destroying the religion, cutting it down. Psalm 106, verse 34 says this is what they did not destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded them, but they mingled with the nations and adopted their customs. They worshiped their idols, and it became a snare to them, right? If we know our Old Testament, we know that they did start intermingling with it. They did pick up their customs. They did worship false gods, and this became a problem for Israel. Let's go to number 5. Here's what we see also in the Old Testament. We see a ton of grace. When we look at these stories, when we look at the progression of it, we know this is the way it started with Abraham, right? All the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. That was God's intent of calling Abraham out so that all the nations of the world could be blessed through him. We know that mostly during this time of the Judges and Joshua, where these holy wars were taking place. But after Solomon, the prophets started picking up on something else. God started telling the prophets, giving them a new insight to what was coming, that there would be a salvation of all these people together. Psalm 87, verse 4 through 6 says, I will record Rahab, meaning Egypt, and Babylon among those who acknowledge me. Philistia too, and Tyre, along with Cush, talking about Ethiopia. And will you say, this one was born in Zion? Indeed, of Zion it will be said, this one and that one were born in her. The Most High himself will establish her. The Lord will write in the register of the peoples, this one was born in Zion. What the prophets were picking up is that God was going to bring salvation to all these different groups, that they weren't excluded, that they were included. And the prophets, I love it, started picking up. These were some of the chief oppressors of Israel. And yet God is relaying to the prophets that they were going to be called into his people.